Lesson 56. The verb fero, expressions of place, the ablative of separation, Caesar, Book 1, Chapter 5, begun. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're on page 167, and we have quite a few things to talk about today, mainly lots of odds and ends. As I mentioned before, we're at a point in the book now where much of what they're introducing as new is material that we've at least touched on at some point. So there's not a whole lot left here that's really truly new. Sometimes they'll give us something as a footnote to help us translate, and they explain it briefly just so we can translate something. But then later they introduce it in a more formal way. So that's what we're seeing at this point in the book. We're seeing them introduce things formally that in the past we may already have covered in a more informal fashion. So let's go ahead and jump in. Probably the most difficult thing in this lesson is here in section 443, and that is the verb fero. I'm sure we've run into this verb before, but here we're studying it in a more formal way. It's very irregular, and not only is it irregular, it's also what I would refer to as a suppletive verb. We've talked about suppletion before. Suppletion is when one certain tense of a verb is covered by a different verb. You see this in ancient Greek all the time. In fact, this same verb, fero, exists in Greek, and it's also suppletive in Greek. Each of the principal parts in Greek has a different weird stem, and that's what we have here too. So let's look at the four principal parts. The first two principal parts aren't so bad, fero and fere, but then for the perfect tense form, that's the third principal part, we have tuli, that's T-U-L-I. And then for the fourth principal part, the supine or neuter perfect passive participle, whatever you want to call it, that is latum, L-A-T-U-M. So say this to yourself a few times for practice, the four principal parts, fero, fere, tuli, latum. Fero, fere, tuli, latum. Say that over and over again and help yourself memorize those four forms by rote, and it will help you to become familiar with all the different forms of the verb fero. Let's turn to the appendix and take a closer look at the paradigm for this particular verb. It's on page 278. So let's take a look here. Section 41 of the appendix, in the present tense indicative, at the beginning of the left-hand column, we have the present tense indicative. So if you're speaking with an ancient Roman and you want to say, I am carrying, you would say fero. If you want to say you are carrying, you would say fers, F-E-R-S. If you want to say he, she, or it is carrying, you would say fert. If you want to say we are carrying, ferimus. Y'all are carrying, fertis. They are carrying would be ferunt. So the thing to notice here is that sometimes you have a vowel between the stem and the personal ending, and sometimes you don't. So for example, in the first person plural, ferimus, you have the F-E-R part of the word, and then you have mus, that's the first person plural ending, the we ending, but then you have the letter I there. So it's ferimus, but in the second person singular, there is no vowel there, it's just fers. It's not feris, it's just fers, and then fert for the third person singular. The imperfect tense isn't so hard. Ferebam, ferebas, ferebat, ferebamus, and so on and so forth. The future tense is pretty normal for a third conjugation verb. Feram, I will bear or I will carry. Feres, you will carry. Feret, he, she, or it will carry. Switching to the perfect tense, we have tuli. Okay, so that's based on the third principal part. Remember the four principal parts, fero, fere, tuli, latum. So tuli, if you walk up to an ancient Roman and say tuli, that means I carried. Tulisti would be you carried. Tulit would be he, she, or it carried. Tulimus, we carried. Tulistis, y'all carried. Tulerunt, they carried. For the pluperfect, you take the perfect stem and you just add eram, eras, erat. Tuleram would be I had carried. So that's not too hard. Future perfect, tulero, I will have carried. If you want to tell one person a command, carry, you would say fer. If you want to say that command to more than one person, you'd say ferte. Present tense infinitive is fere. Perfect tense infinitive is tulisse. You'll see those probably in ut clauses that require a subjunctive verb. And the future active infinitive, laturus esse. So here with the infinitives, you see all three different stems operating there. Moving to the top of 279, in the left-hand column, we have perfect tense passive forms. So latus sum would be I was carried. If you are a male, you would say latus sum. Remember, this is a gendered verb because it contains a participle. So the participle is going to match the grammatical gender or the natural gender of the subject of that verb. So if you're a female, you'll say latasum. If you're some kind of neuter object, for example, in Latin, the word poculum is a neuter noun that means cup. So if you're a talking cup and you say, I was carried, you'd say latum sum. If it's going to match the grammatical gender of poculum. For pluperfect, latus eram, or lata eram, or latum eram. That would be I had been carried. So we don't have to go over every form here. You have enough experience working with verbs now that you can look at a paradigm and understand it on your own. However, I will point out one other quick thing. Back to the previous page, page 278. Look in the right-hand column where it says participle. A present participle is ferens. So someone who is carrying something, you could say, hey, that's a person carrying a bucket. And so that would be ferens. Laturus would be about to carry. Ferendi is the genitive gerund. So that would be of carrying. Okay, so we don't have to go through every single form. I just wanted to give you a few highlights of how this verb works. So let's go back to our lesson. And one other thing, keep in mind that we have lots and lots of English words with these stems embedded in them. Also, lots of Latin words with these stems. This verb often gets compounded with prepositions. So we'll see that in a moment below in the vocabulary. We'll revisit that in just a minute. With that in mind, let's go to section 444, which is our vocabulary section. Our first word is kibaria. That's a neuter noun of the second declension, which apparently is only in the plural. So kibaria is neuter plural, and then kibariorum would be genitive plural. At first glance, you might think kibaria is a first declension noun, but it's really a second declension neuter plural. And that means food. It's probably related to the word kibus, which means food. And we have this adjective, molita, which means ground up. Something that's ground up, like when you grind up wheat into flour. So kibaria molita means literally ground up food in the sense of perhaps flour or meal, like barley meal or corn meal. In other words, when it's ground up into some kind of powder that can be mixed with water and then baked into something. The word molita is really a fourth principal part. It's really a perfect passive participle, which we will see in a moment. Next we have reditio, reditionis. That's a third declension noun that means return, and it's related to the verb redeo. Redeo is really just re plus ao. Remember that the prefix re in Latin means back or again. If I'm standing in one place and I walk away from that place, but then I walk back to that place, I'm at that place again. So I'm there again in the sense that I've come back to that place. So back and again really have a lot of overlap in what they mean. So that re prefix plus ao, literally to go back. More on that verb in a moment. So reditio is a noun form of this verb. The it in the middle of the word, that's the root that's from ao, because remember that ao has ao, ire, iwi, itum. So itum is one of the roots or stems of this verb. So re plus it, that has the ingredients that mean a going back. Moving on, we have rus, ruris. That's a neuter noun of the third declension, which means, rural areas like the countryside. In fact, that's where we get our English word rural. Now we have a few verbs that are really just compounded forms of fero. We have con fero, ex fero, and in fero. Con as a prefix can mean with or together, or it can be an intensifier, strengthening the meaning of a verb. Here it just means together. So con plus fero, literally to bring together. And we have an idiom here, se con fero, literally means to carry yourself. And so it means flee. If you're in a battle and you say, I'm going to carry myself out of here, that means you're going to flee from the battle. Next we have fero, which is really just ex plus fero, to bear or carry out. In the first principal part, the letter X in EX, it gets turned into an F due to a linguistic phenomenon known as assimilation. So fero, efere, and then in the third principal part, you do not have assimilation. You have extuli. So the X stays as an X. So efero, efere, extuli, elatum. That means to carry out. Next we have infero. That's just in plus fero. In here has the sense of upon. To bring something upon someone. Like if you bring war upon someone or bring a disaster upon someone. That's how we'll see it. So confero, efero, infero, lots of Latin verbs that are just compounded forms of fero. And also, these all come into English. We have in English the word confer. If you have a meeting with people and you confer with them, you are talking about something or sharing information or sharing ideas. You're literally bringing people together. If you infer something, if you have a certain set of facts and you look at those facts and then you infer, that means you're bringing in a thought or an idea, making an inference. Also, we have conference, inference. So all those words in English that have fer like that, those are all directly from the Latin word fero. Next we have molo. That's where we get the word molita, which means ground, as in ground up. So molo, molere, moloi, molitum means grind. Molitum is that fourth principal part. So molitus, molita, molitum is ground, something that's having been ground up. I just checked the dictionary, and it turns out that molo is actually related to the English word meal. So if you see a bag of cornmeal or barley meal, that word meal there is related etymologically to molo. Why? Because it's ground up. It's something that's been ground up into a flour-like substance, a powder. Next we have redeo, which we already talked about a moment ago. So the re part means back or again, and then ao means to go, so literally to go back. You may be wondering, why is the letter D there between re and ao? We also see this D thrown in the word prodest. Prodest means something like it is advantageous, it is beneficial, and that's really just pro plus est. I don't know for sure, but an educated guess would be that the letter D gets put in there for ease of pronunciation. If you have two vowel sounds in a row, like pro est, that can be kind of awkward to say. The human mouth likes to have alternation between vowel and consonant. Like when we say doobie 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 doo, that's a constant alternation between vowel and consonant. It's very easy to say because it's easy to articulate each new vowel sound. So if you have pro-est, that's a little bit awkward to say. But if you put in the letter D and it's prodest, now you have a consonant to articulate the vowel off of. You have a consonant that can start a new syllable. So prodest is really pro and est. And here, redeo is really re plus ao. So I think the D gets put in there to prevent there from being two awkward vowels in a row. Instead of re-ao, which is hard to say, you get redeo. Sometimes in Latin and Greek, you'll hear these spelling changes referred to as being there for the sake of euphony. That's E-U-P-H-O-N-Y. The word euphony comes to us from Greek roots. EU at the beginning means good, and then P-H-O-N, that part of the word means sound. We see that root in words like phonetics, phonology. So the word euphony literally means good sound. These kinds of spelling changes can be referred to as euphonic spelling changes or spelling changes done for the sake of euphony. But at the most basic level, it's giving you an alternation between consonant and vowel, which eases pronunciation and prevents there from being two awkward vowel sounds in a row. Next, we have another important and very irregular verb, which is tolo. So the four principal parts of that are tolo tolere, sustuli sublatum. Again, we see the phenomenon of suppletion. Tolo and tolere, the first two principal parts, that looks very normal, like a normal third conjugation verb. But then when you get to the third principal part, it's a whole different stem. Sustuli. What is sustuli? Well, it looks a whole lot like fero, does it not? Remember the four principal parts of fero are fero, fere, tuli, latum. So the third principal part of fero is tuli. And what do we have here? Sustuli. It's really just tuli, but with the prepositional prefix sub. So sustuli is really sub-tuli. So sub plus tuli, and then the B in sub gets turned into an S. So it becomes sustuli. We just talked a minute ago about euphony and how sometimes spelling changes occur for ease of pronunciation. In the fourth principal part, again, it's the same fourth principal part as fero, but again with sub, the preposition sub, prefixed to the front of the word. Here we do not have a spelling change. The B in sub remains as a B. So the fourth principal part, sublatum, but in the third principal part, sustuli, that B turns into an S. So you might be asking the question, if this verb means to raise or take away, why have the preposition sub in it? Sub means under, right? So if something is going up, why would you want a preposition in there that means under? Wouldn't you want a prepositional prefix that has to do with going up, like supertuli or, something like that? And I've thought about this before, and I've actually seen other verbs that have a sub prefix that also have to do with upward motion. So picture this in your mind. You and your friends want to lift a heavy table. It's a heavy table, too heavy for one person. So you and all your friends gather around the table, and each of you put your fingers up under the edge of the table. And then you lift, and everyone lifts together, and the table goes up. It moves up because everyone's lifting. But to do that lifting, you have to put your fingers or hands under the table. So this is the feeling I get from these Latin verbs that have sub in them, but talk about upward motion, that the motion is being viewed as not down in the sense of under, but in the sense of coming from under. The motion is coming from under, and if it's coming from under, that is going up. So for me, that's how it makes sense for these Latin verbs that have sub baked into them, but that refer to upward motion. In fact, there is a verb in Latin which is sub fero. And so sub fero, that turns into suffero. We get assimilation. And so the four principal parts of that verb are suffero, suffere, sustuli, sublatum. So what it looks like to me is that the verb tolo is a suppletive verb, and it's getting its perfect tense stem handled by a different verb. That's what we call suppletion. So it's borrowing the third principal part from another verb, which is suffero. And that's probably why the authors of the book are introducing tolo in the same lesson as fero, because two of the four principal parts for tolo are suppletive forms that are borrowed from a compounded form of fero. Suffero is really sub plus fero, and it can mean to put something under something, or to carry under, or it can mean to hold something up or sustain it. Again, my theory is that the idea is that the motion or the support is underneath in the sense of holding something up. So in order to support something or lift something, you have to get under that thing and then apply pressure from below to raise it or support it or lift it. So that's my theory for why these verbs that have sub can end up referring to upward motion. So the verb tolo tolere sustuli sublatum is a verb that means to take away. The third and fourth principal parts are suppletive forms borrowed from the verb suffero. Again, that's called suppletion. Let's move on now to section 445. And as we do so, we're going to see that the authors of the book want to discuss motion toward places and motion away from places. They want to talk about the ablative of separation. So basically our focus here is the accusative case and how it can show motion toward, and the ablative case and how it can show motion away from. So when you think of the accusative, think of something moving toward something. When you think of the ablative, think of something moving away from something. And we have some model sentences here in section 445. It's really not too difficult. Let's start with number 1. Aquitania ad Hispaniam pertinet. Aquitania is a section of Gaul. According to Julius Caesar, it was one of the 3 main divisions of Gaul. Of course, today we still have the word Aquitania in the word Aquitaine, that region of France. And Hispaniam is just Hispania, which means Spain. Pertinet is a verb that means extend. That's pertineo. So Aquitania extends to Spain. That's what that says. And look at note A below. It says in sentence 1, the place to which is expressed by the accusative case with the preposition ad. But the preposition is omitted with the names of towns, small islands, domus, and rus, as in 2 and 3. So sometimes you can omit the preposition ad when you're saying that something is going to someplace. And we do the same thing in English. When we say that we're going home, we don't say, I'm going to home. We say, I'm going home. We just say the word home without the preposition to. It does not sound strange to our ears to say, I am going home, simply because we're so used to it. But when you think about it, it's a little bit weird. After all, we would not say, I'm going work. We say, I'm going to work. If you leave out the preposition there, it sounds kind of weird. Or if you say, I'm going school, that doesn't make any sense. You say, I'm going to school. But for some reason, when we say we're going home, we leave out the preposition, and it's just, I'm going home. Well, same thing in number 2 and number 3. They're saying that they're going to a place, but without the preposition ad. So number 2, wenit means he came. That's perfect tense. And then Romam is just the name of the city of Rome, Roma in Latin, in the accusative case. So Romam wenit is he came to Rome. So the point they're trying to make is that you do not need the preposition ad. You don't need to say venit ad Romam. If you went up to an ancient Roman and said venit ad Romam, they would understand you perfectly. They would know exactly what you're trying to say. That's just not the, idiomatic, colloquial way to say it. If you were learning Latin as a second language, as many people in the ancient world did, and you said it that way, of course they would know what you mean. But the customary way is to just say Romam without the preposition ad. Same thing in number 3, just like we say in English. Domum ierunt. They went home. So Romam and domum, those are two accusatives that can show motion toward without a preposition. You can also do that with small islands. Moving on to number 4, we're going to talk about separation. Number 4 says, Aquitania agarumna flumine pertinet. Now we have Aquitania, and it's extending away from something. It's extending agarumna flumine, from the Garonne River. Garumna means Garonne, and then flumine is the ablative singular form of flumen, which means river. So here we're showing motion away from something with the preposition a or ab. Let's read section B below. It says, in sentence 4, the place from which is expressed by the ablative with the preposition a. The other spelling of that preposition is ab. But the preposition is omitted with the names of towns, small islands, domus, and rus. So in number 5, we have an ablative, that's Roma, expressing motion away from, all by itself, without a preposition. So number 5 says, Roma profectus est. Profectus est is a form of profaciscor, which means to set out or depart. Profectus is a masculine participle, so it means a boy or man is doing the action. So we have he as the subject. So he departed, that's profectus est. And then Roma means from Rome. This is what we call an ablative of separation. The ablative case can show motion away from something all by itself without any help from any preposition. It's just inherent within the case that it can mean that. It does not need the help of a preposition. If you have a preposition, great. The preposition does it too. But even without the preposition, the ablative can show motion away from. Again, that's called the ablative of separation. Again, in number 6, we see the same thing, domo. That's the word domus, which means home. It's in the ablative singular. So exierunt, they went out. And then domo says from home. And then his itineribus, that's an ablative of means. It means by means of these roads. So Roma is ablative singular, showing motion away from. Domo is ablative singular, showing motion away from. Both of them doing it without any help from a preposition, and that is called the ablative of separation. Moving on to 7, 8, and 9. Number 7 says, ea civitas est in provincia. Civitas means state. Here they're translating it as tribe. That's fine. Ea is a form of is ea id. It's feminine because civitas is feminine. So ea civitas says that tribe. Est means is, and then in provincia means in the province. So number 7 is pretty easy. That tribe is in the province. They're trying to teach us something here. Let's read section C below. It says, in sentence 7, the place where, that is, in, on, or at which, is expressed by the ablative with the preposition in. But the locative case is used instead of the ablative in the singular of names of towns of the first and sometimes third declension, and in domi, ruri, and a few other words. So you've heard me talk about Indo-European probably several times by now. This is lecture 56. So Indo-European is a proto-language, or perhaps a mother language, from which lots and lots of languages come. In Latin, we have 5 noun cases that we usually talk about: nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative. In Greek, we have 4 cases that we talk about often, but sometimes you'll hear people refer to the 8-case system of Indo-European. The idea that earlier in Indo-European, in the prehistory of Latin and Greek, that there were more cases. So occasionally, when you're studying Latin and Greek, you'll have other cases to talk about. For example, the vocative. We've talked about the vocative, I'm sure, by now, and now in this particular lesson, they are referring to the locative. What does locative mean? Well, the Latin word locus, L-O-C-U-S, means place. So a locative case is a case that refers to telling you where something is, what place it is in. So in sentences 8 and 9, you're learning a couple of locative cases that have survived from earlier stages of Latin. So in number 8, the word Romae is a locative form. It means at Rome. It looks just like a nominative plural, or a genitive singular, or a dative singular. It's spelled the same, but in this particular instance, it's a locative. It's saying where something is. In this particular case, at Rome is what it means. In number 9, domi is a locative noun that means at home. So Romae means at Rome, domi means at home, and those are locatives. You don't see them too often, but occasionally you will see them, so it's good to know about them. Also, ruri, R-U-R-I, that's another locative that means out in the countryside. So number 8, Caesar Romae non remansit. The verb remansit is a form of remaneo, which means to stay back in the sense of remain. It's perfect tense. So Caesar non remansit says Caesar did not stay, or Caesar did not remain. And then Romae means at Rome. So again, this is an example sentence showing you a locative Romae. In number 9, remanserunt is also perfect tense. That means they remained. And then domi is a locative that means at home. So they remained at home. Okay, so in these 9 example sentences, we've seen that the accusative can express motion toward without the help of a preposition. We've seen that the ablative case can express motion away from without the help of a preposition, and the locative case can show location without any help from a preposition. And so that's what they want to teach you here in this particular lesson, is some of the special powers of some of these cases. And you can review that at the top of page 169 in section 446. You can have a preposition that helps express these movements, these directions, or in the examples we saw above, you can not have a preposition. In 447, we're going to talk a bit more about the ablative of separation. And you've heard me say this a million times by now, but here the authors of the book are actually saying it too. Down in section 448, it says, note, the first use of the ablative was to express separation. Observe the derivation of the word ablative from ab, which means from, and the supine stem of fero, bear. So the word ablative consists of the preposition ab, which means from, and then the lat part, that's the fourth principal part of the verb fero, fere, tuli, latum. So the word ablative means to carry away or to bear away. That's why I have my dumb joke where I say it's easy to get carried away with the ablative. The ablative case has all kinds of uses, and so when people split hairs about it and argue over what kind of ablative it is, I say it's easy to get carried away with the ablative. It's a dumb joke I made up, but it's kind of educational because it helps you remember the actual word ablative means to carry from or to carry away. And so that's really the original use of the ablative. So here, when we study the ablative of separation, we're studying the ablative case in its natural habitat, so to speak. This is the use that it really lives for, is to show separation. And so over time, the ablative case got used to say other things like source. If you say that something comes from something, you can use the ablative to say that it comes from something in the sense of that's the source of it. And then it develops even more in different ways. Like if you want to say ablative of means, it develops into those uses too, but the original use was separation. The other uses apparently developed over time. So back to section 447. Here we are talking about the ablative of separation. You'll see in the paragraph below, it says, in these sentences, the ablatives denote separation. This use of the ablative is found with verbs or kindred adjectives, meaning keep away from, deprive, free, be absent. And so when you see that kind of verb, a verb that talks about being away from something, you can have an ablative of separation working along with it. You can have the preposition a or ab, or you can not have the preposition. Either way, it's still showing separation because, again, as I mentioned before, the ablative case does not need any help from a preposition to show separation. It's just baked into the ablative case. So let's take a look at these model sentences here in 447. In number 1, Belgae a cultu provinciae absunt. The subject is Belgae, that's the Belgians, and the verb is absunt. That's the verb absum, which means to be absent or to be away from something. If someone doesn't show up to class and the teacher says, "Hey, where is Fred?" you can say, "Well, Fred is absent." So that is one way in Latin to use the verb absum, to say that someone is not present. Here, it's meaning something like people are away from something in the sense of they're far from something. So you can use it in both ways. So number 1 says, the Belgians are away from, or perhaps they are far from. And then a cultu, we have a prepositional phrase with a, showing the idea of being away or from. So really we have the preposition ab here twice. We have it once prefixed to the verb sum, then we have it again before the word kultu. Kultu is a fourth declension noun. Kultus, it means something like culture, refinement. Of course, it's related to our English word culture. And then provinciae is genitive, that means of the province. The idea here is that in the south of France, or, well, back then it was called Gaul, in the southern part of Gaul, things were more sophisticated. Roman culture had taken root more. Since that was the first province of the Romans, it had the most Roman cultural influence. The Belgians, as we see today in the country of Belgium, the Belgians were located way at the top of Europe in the extreme upper right corner of Gaul, a long distance between them and the south of France, the area called Provincia. So what this is saying is that the Belgic tribesmen were away from the cultural aspects. They were far away from the refinement and the culture of the more sophisticated southern area, the province known as Provincia. Okay, so number one says the Belgians are away from the culture of the province, or the Belgians are away from the sophistication of the province. There we see the ablative, kultu, expressing the idea of being away from something, but it has a preposition. In number two, we're going to see it expressing that, but without the help of a preposition. So number two, Helvetios itinere prohibuit. Prohibuit is perfect tense. That's the verb prohibeo, which means to hold back, keep back, prevent, stop. We do not have an explicitly stated subject, so the subject is just he, she, or it. So our subject is he, and then the verb would be prevented, kept back, or stopped, something like that. The direct object is the Helvetios, that's the Helvetii. So he kept or prevented the Helvetians. And then we have itinere. That's an ablative singular. That's the noun iter from the third declension. This is the ablative of separation. It's showing the thing that they were kept away from. He kept the Helvetians from their march. Their translation here is a bit smoother English. He kept the Helvetians from marching. That's fine, it's a bit smoother. I'm translating it literally. So he kept the Helvetians from marching or from their march. So in number one, we have from something, from the culture, from the refinement. In number two, we have from something, from the march. In number one, it's expressing it with a preposition. In number two, they're expressing it without a preposition. So you can have a preposition helping you or not, because the ablative case, the ablative of separation, can show separation without the help of a preposition. Because again, that was the original use of the ablative, to show separation. Let's move on now to section 449. That's our translation exercises for this lesson. Go ahead and turn off the recording and do all the exercises. And when you're finished, turn the recording back on and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've done your translation exercises. Let's go over these together, starting with number one. Number one says, tela conferuntur. The subject here is tela. That's the noun telum, which means something like a javelin or a spear, some kind of missile that you throw. And conferuntur, that's a form of confero, which means to bring together or gather. It's present tense, third person plural, and it's passive. So the idea is the spears are being gathered together, or just the spears are being gathered. Number two, Helvetii impedimenta in unum locum contulerunt. The subject is the Helvetii. The verb is contulerunt. That's the same verb as in number 1. It's confero, except this is in the perfect tense, so we have a different stem. Remember that the 4 principal parts are fero, fere, tuli, latum. So in the perfect stem, you have tuli, T-U-L, as the stem. So contulerunt says they gathered. So the subject and verb are the Helvetii gathered, and impedimenta means baggage, equipment, in other words, all their stuff. And in unum locum says into one place. Notice that in here is taking the accusative, so it means into. So number 2 says the Helvetii gathered their baggage into one place. Again, contulerunt is perfect tense. Number 3 is next. Haedui frumentum non conferent, quod debent. Again, we have the same verb. Conferent is confero. Here it's future tense. So conferent says they will gather. The subject is the Haedui. That's one of the tribes in Gaul. That's the tribe that was an ally of Rome. So the subject and verb together, the Haedui will gather. It's being negated by non, so it's really the Haedui will not gather, and then frumentum means grain. So the Haedui will not gather the grain. Now we have a relative clause, quod debent. There's a footnote here. Footnote 1 says pronoun. The authors of the book are reminding us that this is a relative pronoun, not some other meaning of quod. You know, the word quod can also mean because. And debent says they owe. That's the verb debeo, which means to owe. That's O-W-E. So it does not say the Haedui will not gather the grain because they owe. That's not what it says. It's not because. It's a relative pronoun. So number 3 says, the Haedui will not gather the grain which they owe. Number 4 is next. Hostes ad impedimenta se contulerunt. The subject here is hostes. That means enemies. Contulerunt is the same verb we've had for the past few exercises. That's confero. Here, we're seeing it as part of an idiom. Se plus confero means to betake oneself in the sense of flee. Contulerunt is perfect tense. Notice that it has tuli, or the T-U-L stem in there. That's a visual cue that it's perfect tense. So without se, without it being part of this idiom, it would say, the enemies gathered. Hostes contulerunt. The enemies gathered or the enemies collected. But with se here, that reflexive pronoun, it has the meaning of they collected up themselves in the sense of they fled. Ad impedimenta says to the baggage. In other words, the enemies might have had sort of a headquarters or a camp where all their baggage, all their stuff was, and they retreat to that area. So number 4 says, the enemies fled to their baggage. Number 5 is next. Ei, qui flumen transierant, suis auxilium fere non potuerunt. The subject here is ei. That's a form of is, ea, id. And it's working as a substantive. It's really a pronoun here, not an adjective. It means those people or these people. And the verb is potuerunt. That's the verb possum, and it's perfect tense. It's being negated by non. So ei, non, and potuerunt together will say, those people were not able, or just those were not able. We can throw in a word like people, men, soldiers, whoever AE is referring to. We have a complementary infinitive working along with potuerunt, and that's fere. That means to carry or to bear. That's one of our new verbs for this lesson. And auxilium is the direct object of fere. So what we have so far would say, those people were not able to carry help. Okay, auxilium means help, aid, or assistance. Probably a better translation for fere here would be bring. So those people were not able to bring help. And suis is dative plural. That means their, in the sense of their people. Suis ordinarily is an adjective. Here it's functioning as a substantive adjective. So literally, those people were not able to bring help to their, T-H-E-I-R, to their what? Their friends, their countrymen, their people, their soldiers, their, we don't know. So we have to throw in some kind of word to help fill out this substantive adjective, suis. But regardless of that, you should notice that suis here is a classic case of a dative noun being the indirect object in a sentence. Remember that an indirect object is the party in the sentence that is benefiting or receiving. So in this sentence, suis would be the recipient of the auxilium, the help. The context here is that when the Helvetii are trying to cut through Roman territory, they end up crossing a river. And so part of the people get across the river and part of the people don't get across the river. So what it's saying is that the people who did cross the river, they weren't able to help the people who hadn't yet gotten across the river. The people who had not yet crossed were being killed by the Romans. And so the people already on the other side of the river couldn't help them because they were separated by the river. So our relative clause here, qui flumen transierant, qui is a relative pronoun. It's masculine and plural because its antecedent ae is masculine and plural. It's nominative because it's the subject of the relative clause. The verb here is transierant. That's trans plus ao, which means to go across. And it's pluperfect. It's not transierunt. That would be perfect tense, but it's transierant. So it means they had crossed. So qui flumen transierant says, who had crossed the river. Flumen is accusative, that means river. So potuerunt, the main verb, that's perfect tense, but then transierant is pluperfect. That's talking about something that happened even further back in time. So the whole sentence says, those people who had crossed the river, in the sense of who had already crossed the river, they were not able to bring help to their people, to their friends, their countrymen. Probably countrymen would be a good way to translate suis, because it's talking about Helvetii trying to help other Helvetii. Okay, but what I want you to get is that in the relative clause, it has the idea of already. They had already crossed, so they couldn't help the people who had not yet crossed. So number 5 altogether says, those people who had crossed the river were not able to bring help to their countrymen. Number 6 is next. Domum reditionis space sublata est. The subject here is space, which means hope, and the verb is sublata est. That's a form of the verb tolo, which means to take away. Space is grammatically feminine, so sublata, the participle, that's feminine too, to match the gender of space. Sublata est is perfect and passive, third person singular. So space, sublata est, says, hope was taken away. Reditionis is genitive singular, working along with space, so it's the hope of a return. Domum means home, and that's accusative, showing motion toward without a preposition. Just like in English, when we say, I'm going home, we don't use a preposition. So number 6 says, the hope of a return home was taken away. Number 7 is next. Finitimis bellum inferunt. Inferunt is our verb. That's the verb infero, which means to bring upon. It's third person plural, present tense. There is no explicitly stated subject. So the subject is they, and the verb is bring upon. So they are bringing upon, or they bring upon. And what do they bring? Bellum. So they bring war upon. And who do they bring it upon? Finitimis, their neighbors. That's dative plural. It's the indirect object. Remember that the indirect object in a sentence is the party that is benefiting or receiving. Also, I'm sure the authors of the book would like for you to think of finitimis as being dative because of dative with compound verbs. That's fine, but even without it, it would still be the recipient and would still be dative. So number 7 says, they are bringing war upon their neighbors. Number 8 is next. Ea pars civitatis Helvetiae calamitatem populo Romano intulerat. The subject here is pars, which means part, and the verb is intulerat. That's the verb infero, which means to bring upon. Notice that we're in the perfect stem here. We have tul as the stem, and it's actually pluperfect. If it were perfect, it would be intulit, but here it's pluperfect, so it's intulerat. So pars and intulerat will say the part had brought upon. Ea is a demonstrative adjective working with pars. It's feminine because pars is feminine. So we can translate ea pars as this part or that part or the part. Here it feels like ea has more demonstrative force. So let's translate ea as that. We can say that part or perhaps this part. Let's go with this. Let's say this part had brought upon. And pars is possessed by civitatis, this part of the state. And Helvetiae here is working as an adjective. It means Helvetian. Notice that it's genitive singular, feminine. So it's really the first and second declension adjective, Helvetius, Helvetia, Helvetium, which means Helvetian. So this part of the Helvetian state had brought upon. And what did they bring? Calamitatem. That means disaster. And who did they bring it upon? The Populo Romano, the Roman people. So number 8 says, this part of the Helvetian state had brought disaster upon the Roman people. Number 9 is next. Miles molita cibaria sibi domo effert. The subject here is miles, which means soldier, and the verb is effert. That's the verb fero. It's ex plus fero. It means to bring out. It's third person singular present tense. So the soldier is bringing out. What's he bringing out? Molita cibaria. That's a ground up food, probably referring to some kind of meal, cornmeal, flour meal, barley meal. Keep in mind that in British English, the word corn means something different than in American English. In American English, corn means the yellow stuff that grows on the cob, corn on the cob. In British English, corn means grains in general. It can mean flour, barley, things like that. I believe the British call American corn, they call it maize, M-A-I-Z-E. And really, I think it's the Native Americans who introduced Europe to corn, American corn, corn on the cob. So ground up barley would be barley meal, ground up corn would be corn meal. And I think the idea is you mix it with water and then you can bake things with it. It turns into batter. I'm no chef, but that's my basic understanding of it. So let's translate molata kibaria as meal in the sense of flour. So the soldier is bringing out meal. Sibi means for himself. That's a dative reflexive pronoun. And then domo means from home. That's an ablative of separation. We studied that earlier in the lesson. So number 9 says, the soldier is bringing out meal for himself from home. To put it in a slightly nicer English word order, we might say, the soldier is bringing out meal from home for himself. Number 10 is next. Molata kibaria sibi milites domo efere iubunt. Here we have a verb of commanding or ordering. That's the verb eubeo. We don't have an explicitly stated subject. All we have is just the verb iubunt, which means they are ordering or they are commanding. And this particular verb of commanding works with an accusative. The person that you're ordering to do something is in the accusative. There's another common verb of commanding, which is impero, related to our word imperial. And with that word, the person who's being ordered to do something gets put in the dative case. Perhaps because it's a compound verb, I'm not sure. So different verbs of ordering or commanding work differently as far as grammar and syntax. But with this particular one, it takes an accusative. So the subject here is they, the verb is command or order. So they command or they order, or they are commanding or they are ordering. And then milites is the people being ordered to do something. So they are ordering the soldiers. And then we have the infinitive efere, which means to bring out. So they are ordering the soldiers to bring out. Domo, again, means from home. That's ablative of separation. Molata kibaria, again, that means meal. Some kind of ground up substance like barley, perhaps, or wheat. Sibi is dative, and it can be singular or plural. It does not have a singular and plural form. It's the same form for both. So in this particular sentence, it's plural. So number 10 says, they are ordering the soldiers to bring out from home meal for themselves. Number 11 is next. Caesar bibracte iwit. The subject is Caesar. The verb is iwit. That's a perfect tense form of the verb eo, which means to go. So it means went. And so Caesar iwit says Caesar went. And then bibracte is the name of a town in the territory of the Haidui. And so that's accusative, and it's showing motion toward without a preposition. You could say Caesar went to bibracte by saying Caesar ad bibracte iwit, and that would make perfect sense, but you don't need the preposition ad with the name of a town. You can just have the name of the town in the accusative, and bibracte is neuter, so I believe this is accusative. So number 11, Caesar went to bibracte, and so you have motion toward without a preposition. Number 12 is next. Eorum, qui domum redierunt, erat numerus milium centum et decum. So the main subject and verb here, the subject is numerus and the verb is erat. So we could translate it as there was a number, or we could say the number was. Either way, let's just try to feel it out as we go. Centum et decum says 110, and milium means thousands. It's genitive plural. Ordinarily, we would expect centum et decim milia. For example, when we were working with distances of miles, we would see, milia passuum. Here, though, milium is genitive plural. So we'll circle back to that in a second. Eorum is a genitive plural form of is ea id. That's the demonstrative adjective or demonstrative pronoun that we have been working with for quite a while. And so eorum could say of those or of these. It's genitive plural. Let's try of those. So the idea here is that there was a number of those. Erat numerus eorum. Or we could say the number of those was. Either way works, but that's the basic structure of the sentence. We have a relative clause working from eorum as the antecedent. Qui is the relative pronoun that begins the relative clause. Qui is masculine and plural because its antecedent eorum is masculine and plural, but it's nominative because of the role it plays in the relative clause. In the relative clause, qui is the subject. Redierunt is a form of the verb redeo, which means to go back in the sense of return. And it's perfect tense. So qui plus redierunt says who returned. Domum is accusative. It means home. And it's showing motion toward without the help of a preposition. So qui domum redierunt says who returned home. So here's how the sentence adds up. Of those who returned home, there was the number 110,000. Or we could say, of those who returned home, the number was 110,000. According to the footnote 6, it says milium is genitive because it's a predicate genitive. Apparently, it's trying to agree with eorum. So maybe it's saying something like, of those who returned home, the number was 110 of those thousands. I don't fully understand why milium needs to be genitive. Nevertheless, it is genitive plural, and the sentence says, of those who returned home, the number was 110,000. Number 13 is next. Duiciacus plurimum domi et in reliqua Gallia potuit. Our subject is Duiciacus. He's a nobleman of the Haedui tribe. Potuit is the main verb, and that means he, she, or it was able. But with the word plurimum here, the verb potuit takes on a different meaning. With plurimum, potuit means something like to be powerful. Remember that plurimum is a superlative adjective. We have multus, multa, multum, which means much or many, and then plus means more, and plurimum means most. So plurimus, plurima, plurimum, that's an adjective, that's a superlative. It means most. And when you have an adjective in the accusative like this, like plurimum, it can act in an adverbial kind of way. There are different grammatical reasons for why a neuter adjective can be adverbial. I won't go into that right now, but suffice it to say that potuit plus plurimum means something like he was powerful the most, or he was powerful very much. That's literally what it's saying. So with plurimum here acting as an adverb, meaning very much, what we have here with Duiciacus, plurimum, and potuit, literally it says Duiciacus was powerful very much. But you can translate that into English as something like he had a lot of influence, he had a lot of authority, something like that. So it's idiomatic speech. So we can say Duiciacus had great influence. Then we have the locative form domi, which means at home. Et means and then in reliqua Gallia, that's a prepositional phrase that means in the rest of Gaul. So number 13 says, Duikiakos had great influence at home and in the rest of Gaul. The idea is that Duikiakos was so powerful that not only did he have power in his own tribe, but even with other tribes, he had a lot of respect. So he was sort of I guess you could say, an international figure. Number 14 is next. Milites a proilio contenebantur. The subject here is milites, that means soldiers, and contenebantur, that's the verb conteneo, which means to restrain or hold back or keep back or hem in, perhaps. It's third person plural, imperfect tense, and also it's passive. So milites and contenebantur will say something like, the soldiers were being kept back, the soldiers were being held back, the soldiers were being restrained. And then a proilio is a prepositional phrase that says from the battle. So if you have some soldiers who would like to join in the battle and start fighting, but their commanding officer orders them not to, you could have a sentence like this. The soldiers were being kept back from battle. Number 15 is next. Caesar Galliam omnem ab Ariovisti injuria defendere potest. Here we see the verb potest in its more usual meaning of to be able. So the subject is Caesar, the verb is potest, so that means Caesar is able, and we have a complementary infinitive, defendere. So Caesar is able to defend. The direct object of defendere is Galliam, so Caesar is able to defend Gaul. And omnem says all, so it's all of Gaul that he can defend. And what can he defend it from? Ab Ariovisti injuria, from the injustice of Ariovistus. Again, Ariovistus is a German warlord, a German strong man or something like that. The Haidui invite him in. One of the Gallic tribes invites Ariovistus in to come into Gaul and help them fight their enemies. But once Ariovistus is there in Gaul, he says, hey, this place is great. I think I'll take over. So he basically takes over the tribe that he was supposed to be helping, and he causes lots of problems. So whoever's plan it was to invite him in, the plan backfired. So anyway, ab and injuria form a prepositional phrase from the injustice, and then the genitive Ariovisti is sandwiched between ab and injuria. So it's from the injustice of Ariovistus. Ariovisti is genitive singular. The word injuria, you might be tempted to translate it as injury, and that might be good some of the time, but really it means injustice. The I and the N at the front of the word serves as a negative. It negates what comes after it. And IUR, that part of the word is the noun jus juris, which means justice. So literally, injuria means not justice. And that's where we get our English word injury from. You know, injury means usually getting hurt, if someone's physically harmed or physically hurt. But really the root words add up to not justice in the sense of an injustice. So number 15 says, Caesar is able to defend all of Gaul from the injustice of Ariovistus. Let's move on now to section 451. That's our reading from Caesar's Gallic Wars. This is Book 1, Chapter 5. Here the Helvetii are continuing to prepare for their big mass exodus. Quick review, Orgetorix was put on trial for his treasonous activities, and then somehow he died all his followers had whisked him away, apparently, from the trial. The people in charge of the government did not like that, so they started calling up a militia. And then under those circumstances, somehow Orgetorix died. So they've had a huge national crisis, but it doesn't stop them from pursuing their plan. So let's take a look here and see what's happening next with the Helvetii as they prepare for their big exodus. I'll read the first sentence. Post eas mortem nihilo minus Helvetii id quod constituerant facere conantur ut e finibus suis exeant. The subject here is the Helvetii, and the verb is conantur, which means to try. It's third person plural, present tense, and it's that's a deponent verb, so that's an active form there. So the Helvetii are trying, or the Helvetii try, and then facere is to do. That's the verb facio. And then id quod constituerant, that says that which they had decided, or that which they had determined. Constituerant is pluperfect. So quod starts a relative clause. So the Helvetii are trying, or they try to do that which they had decided. Post eas mortem is a prepositional phrase. It's sandwiching a genitive in the middle, eus, and we've seen that many times. That's a popular word order with Caesar. So post and mortem form a prepositional phrase after death. In fact, in English, post mortem is an expression. It's an examination you give a body after someone has died. So post mortem says after death, and then eus means his. That's a genitive form of isea id. Literally, after the death of him is what it says, referring to Orgetorix. But we'll translate it as after his death. And nihilo and minus together, sometimes you'll see those two words together without a space between them as a nihilominus. And it basically means something like nevertheless or nonetheless. On the next page, there's a footnote for that. Nihilo is ablative. It's just the word nihil, but with an ablative ending on it. I didn't even know that nihilo was a thing in the classical period. I thought that word didn't come about until the medieval period. But apparently, here it is in classical Latin. Minus means less. And so, if you really want to analyze this, you could say that nihilo is an ablative of degree of difference. Sometimes when you have a comparative, there'll be an ablative telling you how much the difference is. So here, minus means less, and then nihilo would mean by none. That's how much less there is now. There's none less, meaning that, the Helvetii are just as eager to do their exodus now as they were before. The fact that Orgetorix has died, that's not slowing them down or deterring them at all. So they're none the less eager. They're less eager by none to continue with their plan. That's the idea here with nihilominus. So we'll translate nihilominus as nevertheless or nonetheless. We have an ut clause at the end. Notice again that we have a verb of decreeing or determining or resolving. That's constituerant. And so I think this ut clause here is another one of those ut clauses of determining or resolving, which I pointed out in Allen and Greenough. So it's working from constituerant, and it says that they go out, exeant, from their territory. E finibus suis, literally from their borders, but we'll translate it as from their territory. So the whole thing says, after his death, nevertheless, the Helvetii try to do that which they had decided, that they go out from their territory. The next line says, Ubi iam se ad eam rem paratos esse arbitrati sunt. Arbitrati sunt is the verb. It's a form of arbitror, a deponent verb that means to think. So arbitrati sunt says they thought. And then we'll get some indirect speech here. Se is the subject accusative, and esse is the verb. So they thought that that's se, they thought that they were. And then paratos is a predicate accusative working with se. Remember that se can be singular or plural. It's the same in both forms. Just like with sibi. Sibi can be singular or plural. Same with se. So they thought that they were paratos, and that means prepared. And then ad eam rem, that says something like for the purpose of the thing, for the purpose of this something. We need to translate rem as something specific, like perhaps a journey, trip, endeavor. Translating it as they thought that they were prepared for this thing, that's just not very descriptive. So we need to translate rem with something more descriptive than that. So let's say journey. At the beginning of the sentence, ubi can mean when or where. Here it probably means when. Yam means now or perhaps already. The footnote says to translate it as at length. So this line will say something like, when at length they thought that they were prepared for this journey. Then at the end of line 5, you have incendunt. They set on fire or burn. So when they think they're ready, they start burning stuff. So the subject of incendunt is still the helvetii. It's not stated here in this sentence, but that's the subject still. Let's read the next two lines. Opida sua omnia, numero ad duodecim, vicos ad quadringentos, relica privata aedifica incendunt. So incendunt says they set on fire or they burn. And then the rest of the sentence is just telling us all the stuff they burned. Again, the verb incendo means to set fire to or to burn. Why don't we translate it as to set fire to? So when at length they thought that they were ready for this journey, incendunt, they set on fire, opida sua omnia, that means all their towns. And then numero means in number. Ad duodecim means about 12. So they set on fire all their towns, about 12 in number. Vicos means villages. That's the accusative plural form of vicus, which means village. Quadringentos means 400. Notice that quadringentos is declinable. It's got an accusative plural ending. So vicos ad quadringentos will say around or about 400 villages. And then reliqua privata aedifica. Aedifica means buildings. In Latin, we have the verb aedifico, which means to build. And so an aedificium is a building. That's a neuter noun of the second declension. So aedificia here is neuter plural accusative. So reliqua means the rest of, privata means private, and then aedificia means buildings. Okay, so they set on fire all their towns, about 12 in number, villages, about 400, the remaining private buildings. This is a good example of asyndeton. We might expect to have a conjunction in here like and, perhaps. They burned up all their towns, and their villages and the private buildings. But we don't have that. We just have kind of a list. So this is asyndeton. Asyndeton means not having conjunctions, not having the word and there. Continuing on, frumentum omne praeter quod secum portaturi erant comburunt. Comburunt is our verb. It means they burn up. That's present tense. Keep in mind that Julius Caesar is using the present tense here to talk about past events in a vivid kind of way. That's called the historical present. And so don't be surprised if we slip into secondary sequence, even though we're using the present tense. Because even though it's present, it's still technically a past tense, and he can just slip into secondary sequence. So comburunt says they burn up, and then frumentum is the direct object. So they burn up all the grain. Omne is an adjective of two terminations, omnis, omnes, and omne, from the third declension. Here, it's omne because it's neuter, modifying the neuter noun frumentum. So comburunt, frumentum, and omne, those three words say they burn up all the grain. Praeter means except, and quod is, I guess, a relative pronoun here, meaning something like that which. So they burn up all the grain except that which portaturi erant. Okay, this is the verb porto, which means carry. Portaturi is a future active participle. It means about to carry, and it's nominative plural. And with erant, it says something like that which they were about to carry. In English, we might say, except that which they were going to carry. And secum means with them. It's just the preposition cum, which means with, and then se is ablative. Instead of saying cum se, they say secum. So the line here says, except that which they were going to carry with them. You can also translate portaturi as about to carry. You could say that which they were about to carry with them. If you want to translate it that way, that's fine too. Or you can say that which they were going to carry. The idea is that you translate portaturi as future. The textbook way to translate a future active participle is with the words about to. And that's fine if you want to do that. Next, we have a big fat purpose clause, starting with ut. And so this purpose clause tells us why, that is, for what purpose, they did all this burning. Okay, so they've burned their towns, which is probably their larger civic areas. And they burned all their villages, which are probably much smaller, perhaps just peasants out in the countryside doing agricultural stuff. So they burned their big towns, their small towns, private buildings, and burned up all the grain. So they've burned up a ton of stuff here. And now this ut clause is going to tell us for what purpose they did all that burning. Ut will say, so that, and then the main verb in that ut clause is essent. Okay, that's an imperfect subjunctive of sum. So the purpose clause will say, so that they might be, or so that they would be. And then we have paratiores. That's a comparative adjective. It means more prepared, and it's plural to match the fact that it's talking about a plural group of people, the Helvetii. So the purpose clause says, so that they might be more prepared. And then ad omnia pericula subeiunda. We saw that exact wording, I think, in an exercise. Subeiunda is a gerundive. We can translate ad here as for the purpose of. Omnia means all. Pericula means dangers. That's the accusative plural form of periculum, which means danger. So ad omnia pericula says, for the purpose of all dangers. And then subeyunda, that's the verb eo, along with the preposition sub, and it means to undergo. So here it's a gerundive, so literally it says more prepared for the purpose of all dangers to be undergone. That's very clunky English, so what we do is we translate subeyunda, instead of being passive, it's a future passive participle. Instead of that, we translate it actively and say, for the purpose of undergoing all dangers. So to turn this into smooth English, we flip it around a little bit. We make the voice active instead of passive. So literally, for the purpose of all dangers to be undergone, but we translate it as for the purpose of undergoing all dangers to make it sound smoother in English. So backing up a bit, they burn up all their grain so that they might be more prepared for the purpose of undergoing all dangers. Then we have an ablative absolute, domum reditionis spe sublata. Spe and sublata are ablative singular, and they are forming an ablative absolute. Spe is the word space, which means hope, and sublata, well, that's one of our new verbs for this lesson. That's the verb tolo, tolere, sustuli, sublatum. Those are the four principal parts, and it means to take away. So here, sublata, that participle there, it means having been taken away. That's a perfect passive participle from the verb tolo. So spe sublata says, with hope having been taken away. And then reditionis means of return. That's genitive singular. And it's working with spe. So the hope of return. And then domum means home. That's showing motion toward without the help of a preposition. That's an accusative form showing motion toward. Just like when we say, I'm going home, exactly the same thing here. So it says, with the hope of a return home having been taken away. Okay, so this whole thing says, backing up a bit, they burn up all their grain, except that which they were about to carry with them, or except that which they were going to carry with them, so that, with the hope of a return home having been taken away, that they might be more prepared to undergo all dangers. That's a nice smooth way to say it. Moving on, we have a page turn here right after the word trium. So, trium mensium molita cibaria sibi quimque domo effere jubent. Trium mensium says of 3 months. Those are both genitive plural. Remember that the number 3 is one of those numbers in Latin that is declined. Starting with quatuor, they're not declined. They're indeclinable. But 1, 2, and 3 are declined. And so trium is genitive plural for all 3 genders. And mensium is genitive plural for the word month. So of 3 months, molita cibaria, that means ground up food in the sense of flour or meal. We've seen all this before in the exercises. We have a verb of commanding here. Jubent, they command. Who's the they? We don't know. There's no explicitly stated subject. It's probably the people in charge of the Helvetian government. If they're commanding people to do things, it stands to reason that it's some kind of person in charge, a government official, the people running the government. So jubent, they command, and then quimque means each person. Okay, so jubent says they command or they order each person effere, to bring out, and then domo means from home. The direct object is molita cibaria. That means meal. Sibi means for himself or for herself. And so it's the molata kibaria of 3 months, meaning 3 months worth of meal. It occurs to me just now that 3 months worth of meal would probably be pretty heavy. They'd have to bring it in probably large sacks or big bags of meal. I guess they'd have to haul it on wagons or something. Earlier in the reading, we heard about Orgetorix being tasked with the job of getting lots of carts and lots of pack animals or beasts of burden. So I would imagine that their plan is to load up lots of carts with all the food and all the supplies. So this last couple of lines, it says, they command each person to bring out from home meal for himself of 3 months, meaning 3 months worth. Okay, that was a really long lesson. We've reached the end. Thank you for sticking with me, and I'll see you again next time in lesson 57.